talk to Internal Audit. Hope you've grabbed yourself a cup of tea and are now ready to join me for a chat around how we might support each other through the key challenges for Internal Audit as we move beyond the immediacy of COVID-19 pandemic. Some introduction. First of all, who am I? I'm Liz Sandwith and I'm the Chief Professional Practices Advisor at the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors, UK and Ireland. The Chartered Institute is the only institute or professional body dedicated exclusively to training, supporting and representing internal auditors in the UK and Ireland. We have approximately 10,000 members in all sectors of the economy and all parts of the UK and Ireland. And our members are part of a global network of 200,000 members across 170 countries, all working to the same international standards and code of ethics. So today's topic is the risk agenda as we emerge from COVID-19. Some 6 months now since the UK-wide lockdown, what were the risks keeping us awake in February and early March? Where are those risks now and what has replaced them? Has our ability to assess risk improved? Is risk better managed now than earlier this year? And how effective is our ability to communicate risk and how strong is our control environment at mitigating risk? Here to discuss the topic with me today is Hanif Barma, founding partner of Board Alchemy, an organization that improves and transforms the effectiveness of boards, risks and audit firms. More on this shortly. Remember, if you like Facebook streams and want to spread the word, and I'm sure you do, be sure to share today's live stream. You can do that by clicking the share button in the corner of your screen. After all, the more the merrier. I want us to start by thinking about the World Economic Forum report, COVID-19 Risk Outlook. The crisis has exposed fundamental shortcomings in pandemic preparedness, socioeconomic safety nets, and global cooperation. Governments and businesses have struggled to address compounding repercussions in the form of workforce challenges, disruptions in essential supplies, and social instability. They have had to balance health, security imperatives against the economic fallout and rising social anxieties, while relying on digital infrastructure in an unprecedented way. And we can all think about that when we think about remote working and some of the challenges initially we had that's now become almost business as usual. The economic fallout from COVID-19 dominates companies' risks perceptions. 2/3 of respondents to the World Economic Forum survey identified a prolonged global recession as a top concern for business. COVID-19 has forced drastic containment measures, diminished economic activity, and required fiscal and monetary actions worth trillions of dollars to protect jobs and markets while the economy is in hibernation. More structural shifts are to come as economies balance between managing the pandemic and managing the economic fallout of the lockdown in the near term, while planning for recovery and revival in the medium to long term. Risk professionals suggest that a prolonged recession of the global economy is the top risk. This overarching concern is related to a continued perception of the risk of bankruptcies of large and small firms alike, and the potential failure of certain sectors to recover fully despite the unprecedented responses from governments in terms of support. Similarly, the structural unemployment this is likely to cause, especially for youth, and its effects on demand emerge among the top 10 concerns. Public debt, the disruption of global value chains, and barriers to cross-border movement of people and goods round out the key risks. As countries start to emerge from the immediate health crisis and work on rebooting their economies, potential divergent trends on the role of sustainability in those efforts create emerging risks of a slowing or multi-speed transition of economies and industries. And we can all think about that when we look on the news on a daily basis, can't we? We will see organizations who are making people, and it's thousands now, redundant. And then on the other side, you will see organizations recruiting thousands of people. So there's a balance here, isn't there? On the one hand, calls for a green recovery by a range of leaders, sustainability forced stimulus packages by large economies, and potential changes in production models and consumer behavior may support the sustainability agenda. On the other hand, cuts in sustainability investment, weaker commitments to climate and nature action, and the impact of low oil prices create new risks of stalling progress. Although I have noticed of late the oil prices have started to go up. This might tip the world towards a vicious circle of climate degradation, biodiversity loss, and future infectious disease outbreaks, possibly with severe effects on the broader 2030 Sustainability Development Agenda. One final thought before I hand over to our guest today, Hanif. COVID-19 and the resulting economic crisis may lead to sustained unemployment, deeper inequality, generational frictions, and continued stress on people's well-being. Two risks with significant social effects: high level of structural unemployment and the restricted movement of people and goods. The social dimensions of these economic risks will be felt by people worldwide and create substantial consequences for the longer term. So if you're just joining us today, welcome to our live stream Talk to Internal Audit. Today's theme is Risk Agenda as we emerge from COVID-19. And we're looking at 6 months since the UK-wide lockdown, what the risks were that were keeping us awake in February and early March, if you can remember back that far. Where are those risks now and what has replaced them? And has our ability to assess risk improved? Have we managed risk better now than we did earlier in the year? And how effective is our ability to communicate risk? And from an internal audit perspective, how strong is our control environment in mitigating risk? May I now hand over to my special guest today, Hanif Barma, who is going to explore some of the challenging risks facing us as we start to emerge from COVID-19. As touched on, Hanif is founding partner of Board Alchemy, where he undertakes board and committee reviews and reviews risk and internal audit effectiveness. He brings considerable expertise in risk and assurance and an excellent understanding of board culture and dynamics, risk, board information, and board processes. His work with boards and committees means he brings insight to risk and audit functions from the key stakeholders' needs and expectations. Hanif is also founder of Risk Coalition, which was established in 2018 to raise the standards of risk governance and oversight in the UK. And I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit more about that. So Hanif, over to you.
Great, thank you, Liz. And it's a real pleasure to be invited along today to talk to you and your members and have this opportunity to talk to Internal Audit about the risk agenda as we emerge from COVID-19. Before I get into the risk discussion, can I maybe just take a moment to congratulate you, Liz, on your fantastic achievement recently of your Distinguished Service Award from the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. I've known you for 3 years now, I think. And I can honestly say that's entirely well deserved, and the commitment you show to the Institute and the membership is indeed very, very apparent. So very well done on that. For today's talk, I'd like to just draw on a number of areas of my background. So you mentioned, for example, I'm a founder partner of Board Alchemy, and I think some of the things I've seen in recent months with my work with clients in relation to the boards, board in relation to the boards, the risk functions, and internal audit, I think will be very relevant. The Risk Coalition work has been going on for almost 3 years now. And again, I think some really interesting things have come out of that and the discussions we've had in relation to that. And then thirdly, I sit on a couple of boards and also 2 audit and risk committees. And again, I think some really interesting things have come out of that in recent times, which I can draw on. So that's kind of the background as to where I'll kind of draw from. What I'd like to do is just spend a moment just really briefly telling everybody about the Risk Coalition. And I'll do that very quickly, which is it's an initiative that me and a few colleagues set up about, as I say, 2.5, getting on 3 years ago. Really what we've tried to do is raise the standards of risk oversight in the UK. And we started off with financial services, but actually our work is relevant across sectors. The Risk Coalition itself is a network of professional bodies and membership organisations, and absolutely delighted that the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors are amongst our members. We really set it up to raise expectations, provide a bit of a benchmark that people could assess whether their risk functions and risk committees were up to scratch, and really to fill a gap as there was no such guidance available at the time. And indeed, I think ours is really the only guidance that we have now got in place. And the result of that is a publication called Raising the Bar, which is the guidance, the principles and guidance that we've established following a rigorous process of outreach and consultation. As I mentioned, the scope is financial services, but it's really, I think it's got some very valuable lessons across industry. The way it's meant to be applied is proportionately. So it's very much principle-based, focused on outcomes rather than actually being a detailed sets of requirements and rules. And I suppose, as far as ambition is concerned, what we're really trying to achieve is what you've done at the Institute with your Financial Services Code, and achieve that for risk functions across financial services. So that's really kind of where we're trying to aim for. What I'd like to do is maybe start off with a little bit of reflection, if I can, Liz, which is actually think back over the last few months. If I kind of think back 9 months, none of this was even a germ in my imagination. 6 months ago, I think we would have been on the cusp of lockdown. 4 months ago, we were probably in the depths of lockdown. And 2 months ago, everything was starting to ease. And we find ourselves where we are today. And when I kind of look back, I kind of realize, actually, when we entered the new year, I couldn't imagine kind of what a year we would have ahead of us. As we were entering into lockdown, and then as things progressed, actually my viewpoint was actually very different from what it is today. And if your audience gives a few moments thought to that as well, and just reflects on how they think things have changed in terms of what their outlook would have been, how things might have changed, I think a lot of people would say, actually, things have changed very quickly from one day to the next. And I suppose the 3 things I draw out of the last few months that really underpin the need to relook at risk and the risk agenda are, first of all, one is how unimaginable all this has been. Really, I think if you ask me, this is kind of the work of fiction, and I wouldn't have imagined any of this taking place a few months ago. Secondly, it's really about how things change from one day to the next and how quickly they have. I've said how quickly, if you like, my outlook and my mood has changed over the last 5-6 months. I'm sure that's been the case with a lot of people around optimism and pessimism, what will work and what won't. And we've also seen, for example, I think just a few days ago, from mid-August, I think the lockdown in Greater Manchester was meant to be eased a couple of days ago. And with less than a day's notice, there was a bit of a U-turn, and the restrictions are being continued. So it's making it really hard for people to continue. So the changes are a second factor. And I think the third factor is the differences in viewpoints and different opinions people have. And an FT article of about a month ago was particularly interesting to me. It talked about a number of different approaches firms have about going back to work. One story they talked about was Schroders, where the expectation had been a minimum of 4 days a week in the office. And now they're saying, actually, there's no expectation at all of the need to be in the office. You've got to agree things with your managers, but basically, potentially don't actually need to be stepping foot back in the office again. And in contrast, one of the private equity groups, Carlyle Group, in this article was reported to have said that they want people back at work, but very interestingly, they don't want people traveling on public transport. You can cycle, you can walk, take your own personal transport, but not actually come in on public transport, which raises some very interesting challenges. But we can see one organization is saying, do what you like, stay home, you're being very productive, and another is saying, actually, we want you very, very much back at work. So it's very hard to tell looking forward. And I think that the unimaginable changes, the speed of changes, and the different points of view all really come into play. So I think that's really the backdrop. And just going back to the guidance for a moment, it touches on a lot of the key themes I would like to talk about today. And I won't go through all of them in great detail, but I'd certainly like to mention 5 or 6 areas, which I think the last few months have kind of said to me, actually, either we haven't been doing these things very well, or maybe we need to do them actually quite differently today. And maybe there's a few things where we hadn't really thought about too much, and we actually need to be giving some real thought to as well. So the starting point, I think, is really around the whole area of emerging risk. And I think that, to me, is one of the big topics. There are a few other topics around resilience, about culture, about looking at upsides as well. And I'll come on to all those during the course of this discussion. But just a quick reminder for anyone who's joining us now. I'm guest of Liz Sandwith. I'm Hanif Barma, partner at Board Alchemy and co-founder of the Risk Coalition. And I'm here to talk to you today about the risk agenda and how that might change as we emerge from COVID-19 and from the pandemic. So my first area I really wanted to pick on was really the question of emerging risk. And when we're doing our research for the Risk Coalition's guidance, one of the areas that was coming up quite frequently was the need to focus on emerging risks. So this was in the lead up, really, I guess, over the last year and a half leading up to the launch in December of last year. So pandemic was on some people's risk registers, maybe not on others, but it was certainly emerging risk was something that we talked to a lot of people about. And what we found was actually a lot of people were very focused on current risks and the things they had in hand. And that's, I think, quite understandable. We all deal with what's immediate and urgent, but some of the things that are a little bit longer term weren't really getting enough focus. And people were saying to us, the chief risk officers and risk committee members that we spoke to, heads of audit as well, that actually probably 80 to 90% of time was being spent on existing known risks and not really an awful lot of time looking at the things that were less evident. And particularly, I think I was quite pleased when I look back at some of my reports to clients over the last year as to how many of them said they needed to be spending more time on areas which were of low probability but high impact, which actually wasn't actually receiving an awful lot of board discussion. And I think this is one of the themes, which is actually boards and probably governance functions, whether it's audit and risk, they need to be looking much more at some of these areas that are emerging. They ought to be creating more time to be able to do that. So in financial services, we know virtually all financial services organizations will have a risk committee where they're able to spend time looking at things in a little bit more detail, doing some deep dives, providing a bit more challenge. But risk committees aren't actually that prevalent outside of financial services. So one of the things I would suggest is maybe it's worth thinking about. Do we actually need risk committees outside of financial services as well? And I think perhaps my view is it varies from case to case, but perhaps in the organizations that have perhaps greater systemic importance, perhaps some of the energy companies, some of the utilities, some of the infrastructure companies, perhaps actually having a board level risk committee that provides some genuine, more detailed oversight will not be a bad thing at all. The other side that's related to this, I think, is really around the area of emerging, of horizon scanning. And again, I think a lot of organizations will say that they do horizon scanning, but I think the thing I've found is actually the way people do it can be quite varied. So some people have a pretty robust approach, but for some people, it's really, I think, just sitting around having a discussion and coming up with, have we thought about all the risks that we possibly can? And I think I would encourage people to look at that in more detail. And perhaps the third area in this area is really about looking at scenarios and planning better for future events. And I think this is an area where perhaps people have not focused quite enough time. They probably actually do quite good scenario planning and looking at different alternatives when they're doing their business planning, but not really looking at it again as part of a risk review or risk analysis and looking at how well risks are being mitigated and dealt with. So I think this whole area of scenarios and stress testing, what might really break a company, are things that are worth looking at. And the really important roles for risk committees and board members to look at some of the assumptions, how realistic are they, and really bring their experience from outside the organization to bear to bring a very different perspective. And I think I would probably add, there's also potentially quite a big role for internal audit to play as well. So I think I'd be, as a non-exec, quite interested to know how good our horizon scanning processes were. Is it something that perhaps internal audit could be asked to have a look at? They've got very good networks with other organizations. Most heads of audit I've worked with are very well networked. What are other organizations doing? What kind of risks are they picking up? And I do know many heads of audit are saying, this is what our plan is looking at. These are the areas that we see as high risk. What do other audit functions look at? So there's quite a lot that internal audit can bring to this exercise. The other, potentially, we talk about looking at model risk in financial services. If we're doing scenarios and the like, I guess a phrase that's come up that I've not heard of before is rogue algorithms. And perhaps there's a role to see whether some of our scenario plans and scenario tests contain any rogue algorithms, and whether the outcomes that we're likely to come out with are actually realistic and real. Moving on to a second area, it's really around the area of opportunities. And I think a lot of risk managers we've spoken to as part of the development of the risk coalition, the risk CROs and the risk committee members, they've all quite willingly said, actually, a lot of our time is spent on the downside. We spend a lot of time looking at what might go wrong and how do we prevent that going wrong. But readily accept that actually not enough time is spent on upsides. And I think this is a really important point in the current environment where there's so much uncertainty, the environment is changing rapidly. And actually with the changes, obviously they bring downside and can bring some problems that we need to deal with, but potentially they're actually bringing some very good opportunities as well. So actually, are we using the risk dialogue and risk discussion on our agendas to be looking at the positives and the upside risks and the opportunities that we are creating to really take our business forward? So one board I'm on, we have been looking at what finance we can be getting, but that's to tide us over a short period of when we will have a predicted deficit, albeit a relatively small one. And the discussion that we're having now is actually saying, well, actually, do we need to be investing a little bit more in the business? Do we need to look at new opportunities? And instead of borrowing a relatively small amount, can we borrow a little bit more, actually, that we need, that will actually invest and help transform our business and take us where we want to go? So I think there are some real opportunities in that. And again, the discussion with a lot of CROs and risk committee members and chairs was about to what extent do they operate at risk appetite? And a lot of discussion was, if there's an issue and we've exceeded risk appetite, we need to bring it back in. But there's actually very little discussion about, actually, we're operating quite far below our risk appetite. We've got business objectives, we've got business goals, and actually to achieve the goals that we're looking for, we need to be trying to take a bit more risk. Obviously, a very challenging environment at the moment with the amount of risk we have, but actually potentially there's something that we ought to be doing. So perhaps if we think of risk as a glass and we're not quite, the glass isn't really up to the top, so we've got our glass half full, do we need to actually fill it a little bit more? Or perhaps Liz, with some of the risk managers you and I know, whose view is actually their glasses are quite half, the glasses are half empty, do they need to be replenishing their glasses to be actually operating a little bit closer to risk appetite without going beyond it? And I think a lot of this is actually trying to change mindset. So I think here, the challenge for internal audit is really around, are you just flagging situations where risk appetite has been breached, or are you actually calling out situations where more risk could be taken and the chance of business success actually being accelerated. So I think that's one area I would encourage internal audit to look at as well. The third area I wanted to really focus on was really about risk competencies and skills. And I think this is one area I feel quite strongly about, where I do think across the board, we need to be increasing competencies in risk, not just in audit and risk, but also across the organization as a whole. I did a webinar just very recently for the London Institute of Banking and Finance, one of the members of the Risk Coalition. And one of the questions we had in a poll was, how good is your risk education and training within your organization? And I think it was about a third of people were saying, as a result of COVID, they're thinking that actually we need to be improving the risk education, risk competence that we have across the organization. I read a very interesting article, I think it was in a Bloomberg publication, and if I may, I'll just read that out to you. The opening paragraph, obviously not the whole article. And it says, 20 years ago, corporate risk managers had near zero public visibility. Most were back office staffers who focused on securing insurance. Young people didn't aspire to be risk managers. The pandemic has catapulted the field into prominence overnight. Risk now firmly has the board's attention. Now, I think that's probably a bit of an exaggeration with a bit of journalistic license, but I think actually there's a point there that says we need to be focusing more on risk. The same article actually went on to say in the US, their research suggested that there were about 80 university programs on risk compared to 5,000 on accounting. So I do wonder whether that's the right balance. And certainly I think we need to be focusing much more on risk. And I think a consequence of this will be actually the elevation of the profile of risk CRO, the Chief Risk Officer in organizations. And there's, I think currently with a lot of organizations, the board members comprise the CEO and the CFO. I can actually see a day not too far away when perhaps it's actually 3 executives on the board, the CEO, the CRO, as well as the CFO. So I think certainly maybe some changes in that space. I'll just touch on the other few areas relatively quickly. One is around the shareholder space, and we've been talking about Section 172 for a little while now. I think probably the last 2 years it's quite a popular topic on board agendas. But I think the thing that struck me is actually stakeholders are fundamental to a business. This has always been my view, and really I think what COVID has done is actually bring it to the prominence, bring it to some real prominence. With staff, obviously that's been a really key focus. People talking about obviously furloughs and home working, getting people set up for remote working, when do they come back to work, staff well-being and mental health, all these really key issues, supplies and supply chain impacts, community impacts. And I think this is an area where boards also do need to spend a bit more time, and potentially there's a scope, this role for internal audit to play as well. So boards should be understanding who are their key stakeholders, not just the investors. How do they communicate with them, and whose role is it? Is it the management team? Does the board have a role? And actually, what assurance does the board have about what they're hearing from stakeholders? Is that view robust? And potentially there's a role for internal audit to play there to say, actually, these are things that you're hearing from stakeholders. We've done some work and we're comfortable this is actually a fair view. Another area is really culture. I'll again just touch on that. And again, I think the home working environment and remote working environment is really changing that whole dynamic as well. We've seen a lot of focus in businesses on culture. Internal audit spending increasing time looking at culture as well. I think that's very important. But I think the bit that is now transformational is, how does culture change when you're working from home? So at the Risk Coalition, we've got a really interesting blog by a consultant in this area, talking about psychological safety and the need to maintain that in a home working environment as well. Much bigger challenges in that space. And the other area really is around viability. We've talked a lot about the importance of viability, obviously, in relation to financial statements. And I think actually maybe we need to take that dialogue a little bit broader, not just talk about it in relation to when we look at financial statements, but actually be thinking about, are there any real triggers in the business environment or what we do in the competition? That means we need to be looking at these things afresh every now and again. And as part of that argument or that discussion, obviously, operational resilience or indeed organizational resilience becomes quite a topic. I know we've talked about this as an audit and risk community quite a lot in the last few months, so I won't go into that in great detail. And I think the last area I want to touch on is really about business as usual. And I think it's really important with all the stuff happening with the pandemic and with COVID. There's actually a lot of things that have been on our agendas. And I know, Liz, you produced an excellent publication, Risk in Focus 2020 came out at the end of last year. I'm not sure what your plans are, but I know you're having a discussion next week, and I'm definitely going to be staying tuned to listen into that one as well. But you raised some really good things in there around the importance of cyber and data security. With increased digitalization now, we're facing changes in business models and a greater disruption. Cyber security and data security is becoming a more important risk. Let's not forget about that. And obviously, Internal Audit have a great role to play in that. We've seen with COVID, again, I touched on it earlier around stakeholders, third party and supply chain risks are becoming really, really important as well. We need to be really focused on that. Financial risk, again, really important. And another area, culture, I've just touched on. These are all the sort of things I think that you flagged up last time. I'd be really interested to see how that changes post-COVID. And I think with culture in financial services, the FCA have written to remuneration committees. Interestingly, they wrote to remuneration committee chairs and not risk committee chairs about culture, and really talking about incentives and need to keep focusing on delivering the right results in that space. So I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of the business as usual space. But as I say, Liz, and I'll hand back to you in a moment, this is an area where we need to maintain our focus. And it'll be really interesting to hear your discussion next week as well. But I think really just by way of summing up, I'd like to say there are some really important areas I think that have emerged over the last few months. One is around the need to focus on emerging risks and horizon scanning. Another is in relation to looking at stakeholders and how they are dealing with things and how you're managing your stakeholder relationships and the risks relating to that. A third area is really not just focusing on the downside, but really taking this as an opportunity to look at the upsides. And I think really the fourth area is we're looking at the competencies, the risk competencies in the business, in risk and in audit as well. So I think those would probably be my key messages, Liz. Happy to discuss this further, but let me hand back to you at that point.
Sorry, problems with my mute button. One of the challenges that we face every day. So apologies for that. Thank you ever so much, Hanif. I made a couple of notes there about internal audit, perhaps looking more at horizon scanning. I think that's a really valid point. And I think also I like the concept of the glass half empty, and maybe we can take some more risks, and perhaps internal audit should be looking at opportunities the organization can take as we move forward. So I'd like to bring this session to an end. Huge thank you for your time and some really great thoughts there that we need to take on board, and absolutely will take on board. I'd just like to remind anybody who is now just joining us that today we've looked at the risk agenda, and as we emerge from COVID-19, you know, as we've been talking about, some 6 months since the lockdown, what were the risks that were keeping us awake? And as you said, Hanif, you know, pandemic wasn't on anyone's radar probably November last year. So, you know, thinking about that as well, and how have our skills improved? How have our abilities improved to assess risk? And from an internal audit perspective, how have we contributed to strengthening perhaps our control environments across our organizations as a key mitigator of risk? So huge thank you to you, Hanif, for sharing your thoughts with us. Lots, as I've said, to reflect on and perhaps discuss with our internal audit colleagues. And I mentioned I've got a couple of things on my list, so thank you very much for those. For you, just to remind you, the live stream is available afterwards for those of your friends, colleagues who may have missed the live version on the Institute's Facebook channel. I would like you and beseech you to follow all of the exciting things that the Institute is doing on Facebook, LinkedIn and Twitter. As a member, you have access to the latest edition of Audit and Risk Management, which was launched last week and is available on our website. We focused on a number of really key topics, one of which was diversity and inclusion. So when you've got time, have a read. And to build on what you were saying, Hanif, our Risk in Focus 2021 will be published on the 22nd of September. So a date for everyone to put in their diaries. As always, I'm more than happy to take questions via email at liz.sandwith@iia.org.uk. Next week, 17th of September, Derek Jamieson, our regional director, and I will be looking back. We'll be looking at Risk in Focus 2020. What did the top 10 risks look like in September 2019 when we introduced that? When we were anticipating the year ahead, what were we thinking about? Was crisis management, BCP and pandemic on your risk register? Probably not. And if not, why might that have been the case? Does that link back to what Hanif was saying around horizon scanning? And we're going to look at the key risk lessons we've learned over the last 12 months and have our learnings put us in a stronger place. So as we move forward into the new future, please don't forget to book your slot in your diaries every Thursday, 4 o'clock. Don't forget your cup of tea, your glass of coffee, your glass of water or your cup of coffee. And please remember, talk to Internal Audit because the Institute is listening. Thank you. Stay safe.